Hey, it's Courtney and Christopher, here for another episode of Scribe&Scribble podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the 2020 Emma movie, which I've seen in theaters twice and Christopher once, and then we also rented. This is the first time we've had renting a film that should still be in theaters, but
Yeah.
it was still really good on the small screen, and we'll be picking up the Blu-ray when it comes out on May 19th.
Yeah, definitely. We're just enjoying so many of the scenes of this movie. I was mentioning to Courtney that it just seems like every scene has this great moment at some point. There's almost no wasted scene. So we are going to try to do a few minutes without spoilers, but then we'll let you know when we're going to get into real spoilers. But you wanted to preface it.
Yes. So if you have never seen any Emma adaptation, we will spoil the story very shortly, and then we'll let you know when we're spoiling particular details about this film. This book is from 1815, so I don't want us to spend too much time trying to beat around the general plot, but I really want to make sure that people who are fans of Emma or other Jane Austen works are able to skip out and get to see the film, and I know a lot of people don't or can't rent it right now, so...
But the big difference is, your point is the big differences in this movie are really the way it's done rather than changing anything plot-wise, really. There's not a lot of big differences between this and any other adaptation, so if you've seen another Emma or if you've read Emma, there's not a lot to be spoiled here.
Absolutely. It's more about how the story is told. And Christopher and I were talking about this earlier. That's the whole point of any adaptation of any former story. If you're retelling, you're bringing a new aspect to it, and this film does a great job of bringing the Emma characters and settings that you love from other versions, but telling it in a way that deserves your time. I think the first thing that comes to mind is when the Illumination animated Grinch came out recently. I was very hesitant about it because I was just not sure why there needed to be a third Grinch film.
Right.
But I was convinced by the end of it that there was a purpose for it, and I think that it's nothing compared to Emma, but it's a different audience for it.
Sure.
But I like to approach any adaptation, and even if it's the first adaptation of a book, with the understanding that this is a different interpretation of it, and I want to find the good things about it. Thankfully for Emma 2020, it's not hard to find good things about it.
Yeah, this is just a delightful film. I was thinking about, when we were going back over it and stuff, that the tone of this movie is very bright. It's really positive. It seems hopeful. The music is all very lighthearted and springy. It's beautiful music. It's got a lot of period stuff. But overall, it's just a very delightful... Everything's still brightly lit in this film. I can hardly remember a dark scene. You know, there are a couple of times where it's at night or, things take a dramatic turn.
I do believe the Weston's house is rather dark.
Yeah, and I guess where Miss Bates lives is also a little bit dim.
Yeah, I mean, anywhere with dark wallpaper is going to be immediately darker.
Or curtains. I think it's just a product of the time. They're probably using a lot of candles during the day in this time.
Yes. Yeah, speaking of the music, Fleabag fans will be thrilled to know that Isabel Waller-Bridge did a lot of the original soundtrack, and she's sister of Phoebe from Fleabag, but I believe she might also play a part in that show.
I'm not familiar, but the music in this film is very delightful. We've both been listening to the soundtrack while we've been working from home, and it's just really fun. It's almost a little bit comedic in some of the ways that they use singers, and it still feels very period. I mean, at times they're using a lot more brass than you would have heard probably from this period of classical music, but that's for nerds. So
yeah, yes, but also Mr. Knightley himself, Johnny Flynn, has an original song that plays in the credits. It's called Queen Bee. He has his own band and sings during the film as well.
Yeah, it was really neat to find that he actually does his singing in this. There's, moments where different characters have performances, because I guess that's what they did in this time. They would perform for each other when they got together. And it was neat to see that he actually does some of the singing. And did he do some of the other music as well? Did he write some of the songs, or he wrote his own song?
He definitely wrote Queen Bee. I'm looking right here.
The whole soundtrack, or original motion picture soundtrack, is on Spotify. And I definitely recommend looking it up if you didn't notice it in the film, or if you did and you'd like to hear it again. It's an enjoyable soundtrack. It really adds to the overall tone of this movie being a little bit silly at times. It's funny, like, there's all this. Emma's a little bit of a drama queen. She kind of inspires drama where she goes, or she reads drama into a situation that might not be there.
Yes, and one thing I'd like to say will be a spoiler, so I'll wait. But there's a use of music that is just very funny and dramatic in the film. So let's move on to another thing before I get into spoilers.
Yes, of course.
I think Christopher's touched a bit on the look of the film. We've seen a lot of people describe it as confectionery, which makes it feel like it was a public relations decree to talk about it that way, because confectionery doesn't quite convey the tone, and I've never heard anyone describe anything as that before. So it seems very like one person called it that and everyone else thought it was brilliant. But there are a lot of pastry-like interiors of the houses, and there are there are a lot of cakes for Mr. Woodhouse to frown upon in the backgrounds.
It might be
foregrounds.
It might be a sign of Emma's wealth, but they often put her in very bright colors.
Yeah, there's a lot of yellow in this film, which is a popular Regency color. I believe it was called jonquil. It would do nothing for my complexion.
Yeah, not everyone can pull yellow off. Not everyone wants to. But Emma certainly does in this movie. So
both pull it off and want to.
Yes, yeah.
As for the story, it's about 2 hours, so you have to adjust your expectations that they will not go through the entire book in a film. That's literally impossible, unless you're dealing with like a 50-page Epic of Gilgamesh, which I don't want to watch.
Well, and there are a couple of other things we can talk about here that are in the very first few minutes of the movie. I think very quickly you get this sense of like orchestration or choreography, where they all enter the chapel at the beginning, and you see everybody take their place, and there's almost a comical like nodding to each other, saying everybody's names. It's like this person says everyone's names around them, and then the next person next to them says everyone's names around them, including the person who just spoken. And it's almost comical in how, and you can tell it's like there's a routine here. This has been going on for probably forever.
Right. Well, everyone, as any church should have, has their own place, and you don't sit in it.
They have their pew, yes.
I experienced that a lot growing up. I'm very pleased that our current church does not frown at me if I sit somewhere new, because we're typically late.
We also have an early introduction of Knightley by seeing his butt, which my question is butts, yay or nay? I want to see what you guys think. Did you like our two? You got like Knightley and you've got Emma at different points showing their butts.
A tasteful side butt.
Yes. Yeah, we see a little bit more of Knightley, I believe.
It's very shocking. So yeah, we wanted anyone who hadn't seen the film and perhaps was going to take their mother to see it to prepare yourself for looking at someone's butt next to your mother.
Yeah, it's almost shocking, maybe. There's a lot of things in this movie where there's just suddenly like a surprise. You know, there's like a little bit of a surprise in like how a chord hits or how a shot goes or just like a transition. It's really interesting how the director, what's her name again?
Autumn de Wilde.
Autumn de Wilde. She's clearly thinking about moving you through the movie from shot to shot, even in and outside of, like, she'll use sound to transition to the next shot. So I really like the flow of this movie.
It's certainly a filmmaker's Emma, but that doesn't mean you have to be a filmmaker to enjoy the way it's done.
Yeah, Courtney and I have talked about it before, that this seems to be one of the most filmmaker Austen adaptations. The filmmaking actually almost draws attention to itself a little bit compared to other adaptations that aren't quite so obvious. They could almost be a stage play, or it's just really the camera and the director is trying to get out of the way and just tell the story. Whereas in this one, she's almost winking at us a little bit, being like, hey, this is a movie, and I'm going to use it as if it's a movie.
Absolutely.
And it's very clever.
Yes, and I think that goes really well with the story of Emma in general, because one thing that Jane Austen does in her stories, and none more than Emma, are sucking you into the character's perspective, and therefore being misled with them. I think that the way this film brings surprises into the way it's choreographed helps even out the tone, so that it's not all just clockwork and movie magic, but it's also still guiding us a certain way that sets us up to be surprised.
Yeah. There's also, early on, I think we noticed too in the filmmaking that there's a lot of use of symmetry in this.
Yes.
You were pointing this out. We've both noticed it. But you were saying about Emma being in the center of the frame.
Emma loves to be in the center of the frame, apparently. But she
is.
also is frequently either in between people or having someone in between her. I frequently see Harriet being put in between people as well. And I think that speaks to...
And that would be Emma's best friend, Harriet.
Yes, Miss Smith. Speaks to putting Emma as the center of her own life, but also expecting to be that of the whole town, and how she puts herself and the people she cares about into situations where they're now in between things that they may not want to be. So some conflict they're drawn into because of the way that Emma has choreographed something to go.
Good point. And Emma, you've probably all heard of the POV shot, or the point of view shot. This film never actually uses a point of view shot, where the camera literally takes the view of what the character would be seeing themselves, so as if the camera is their eye. But it will sit right behind Emma. Emma will be sitting in the middle with Mr. Knightley on her left, and then her father on the right. I think that's in one of the first couple of scenes in the movie. And she's kind of blurred out, and we're essentially, psychologically or without, subconsciously, you'll just kind of edit her out a little bit and just think of yourself as being in her position. So you're kind of almost assuming the role of Emma. And like you said, we're taking her view of the world and of these characters because of how the camera's placed. And
yes, another thing that they do, and we talked about this in our live stream, is put the characters' faces very far forward in the screen, not giving them a lot of breathing room in front of the face when they're having an intimate discussion or just any sort of discussion. So
yes.
You'll feel very close. You feel like you're leaning in to hear
Yes.
or to be told what the characters are saying.
Right, like in a horror movie, they might use that kind of shot to make you feel claustrophobic. In this movie, it's used very well because it's a warm or a happy scene, or an intimate scene is usually what it is. And you feel so close. You feel how close those characters are to each other. And man, it's very effective. I'm really impressed with this directing.
It's funny that you bring up horror stories, because Emma, or Anya Taylor-Joy, is frequently in horror films, which is why I've never seen her before. We've already talked about how I'm going to have to work up the courage to watch Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. But she really has such an expressive face.
Yes. That's something that we'll probably get into when we get into spoilers more.
Yes.
But one of the things I love in this movie that really stands out to me is how much time they give characters to react, just on the face. It won't be verbal. And that makes a lot of sense for Jane Austen, too, because sometimes there's not a lot of dialogue for characters. But we see a lot of narrative that would be told to us in the book through the subtext and the subtle acting that these actors are doing. And so Anya Taylor-Joy has these big expressive eyes, and we'll just sit close in on her sometimes when she's reacting to something that happened. And she speaks volumes just through the acting in her face. It's really, really impressive. But she's not the only one. I've seen it in almost every actor in this movie. They really do a great job. And that's obviously both the director and the actors having a lot of good instincts there.
Yes, Miranda Hart is great at at Miss Bates, and I'm really excited to talk about her with the spoilers as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's another thing I'd like to get into more as we go into it. But that's another thing is I think the side characters really shine in this movie. Immediately, we're introduced to Mr. Woodhouse, and he's delightful in his weirdness.
He's a valedictorian. It's not a high school graduate. It's someone who's kind of a hypochondriac, but is actually ill quite a bit. And he's played by
Bill Nye.
Bill Nye.
Yeah.
There's some debate on how to pronounce him.
Yeah, we always, I guess, mispronounced it in our heads, but we recently heard it pronounced Bill Nye, and it's not Bill Nye the science guy for you Americans out there. But he's a very brilliant actor who's been in many films.
For a long time, I thought his name really was Slarty Bartfast, though.
Oh, from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that's one of his roles. A little bit more subtle than he's usually, because he tends to be a very comedic character. But in this role, in this movie as Mr. Woodhouse, he, again, is pretty different, I think, from his other... You know, and I'm not super extensively familiar with his career. He could be, I mean, obviously has a good range.
But this is his first Austen adaptation, absolutely, and I'm not even sure he's read the story. He just really enjoyed the opportunity to do this, and you can tell that.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the things I love in any movie is when I can tell that the actor's really living into that role, loving that role. And I feel like Bill Nye does that here. He just is Mr. Woodhouse, and I don't know. I mean, I like Mr. Woodhouse in most of the adaptations I've seen. I have yet to read the book. I'm going to, because I like this story the more I encounter it. But he is just such a good Mr. Woodhouse.
Yes, yeah, and I would say that it's a very different Mr. Woodhouse from any of the others, and it fits really well into this story. Let's go ahead and get into some spoilers for the story as a whole.
Yeah, so from now on, we're going to just let anything go. We're going to talk about spoilers from the book, from the movie, specific to this movie. So if you haven't seen it yet, we highly recommend this movie. It's very delightful.
I think that if you haven't seen it yet and you want to keep listening, we're not going to ruin the experience. You really should watch it for yourself.
Yes, this is definitely a movie that needs to be experienced. We can tell you all we want about how much we liked it, but, you know, it'll be way more fun if you can enjoy those moments with us. So,
yes.
So what's one of the first things you wanted to get into? I mean, we could talk about Miss Bates.
Yeah, I would love to talk about Miss Bates, especially since that's what I was wanting to reference when we were talking about the music. In Ford's Haberdashery, which is the beautiful setting of the hats and ribbons and accessories shop.
Okay, yes, I forgot the name of that shop.
Well, they say it in such a way that I might even be incorrect, but I tried very hard to read the sign, and it is very small lettering on my computer screen. But we have Emma and Harriet, presumably having moved past the first parts of their friendship and their awkward introduction, Harriet's awkward introduction, because Emma has not felt awkward yet.
She seldom does.
Yeah, well, it gets worse.
Yeah, well, in normal life, it seems that Emma was very sure of herself and confident and comfortable in most situations. But as this movie goes, she gets in more and more hot water or out of her element. Different times, different things at different times. So
she and Harriet are browsing the shop, and Harriet is trying to decide between a couple of ribbons that are nearly identical. You can see Emma's annoyance there. And then this music plays that is just like a short note that announces the arrival of Miss Bates and one of her infamous Jane Fairfax letters.
And she starts yelling, right? Like practically through the window. Was she rapping on the window in this occurrence?
I believe she waits to rap on the window later.
Yes.
And so Harriet's very confused why Emma's trying to hide, because she's not experienced the letter yet. And Emma keeps trying to politely escape the letter. She sits down, but then Miss Bates doesn't have the letter, so she wanders off. And the music continues to just signal a little bit of unrest and how Emma would really like to escape, but she's too polite, or at least too well-bred, to make a run for it. And also, she can't let her friend steal the ribbon she wants.
Yeah.
She still has to check out.
And I'm sure it's not proper for her to actually run also.
There is quite a bit of running in this adaptation, though.
There's so many colors in this scene of just like lots of, jewel tones and pastels as well. And, it's on the furniture, it's on their clothing. And again, Emma was in bright yellow in this scene.
And everyone else is in browns, even Harriet.
And Emma is almost, painfully avoiding eye contact with Miss Bates. I mean, you can feel how cold she's being. And Miss Bates just, as they would say around here, bless her heart, is just so sweet and trying to just have this connection with this person who she looks up to and cares about. And Emma is hardly having it.
Yes. And so I love that Miss Bates gets distracted by one of the items in the shop. It's very funny. And
yes, in some ways this is a good scene too of like going back to a screenwriting aspect of how you would set up a film, where you kind of introduce the character, you introduce the world, and you introduce how things have been up to this point, and then you start introducing some of the things the main character needs to fix. And this is one of the things that Emma needs to fix clearly, is she needs to start like actually caring for the people around her. She's charitable, but she clearly isn't so sweet to Miss Bates. And we'll see that that's also a ticking time bomb that's going to blow up in her face. Because Emma actually has to face a lot of consequences for her actions.
yes.
Going back to Mr. Woodhouse, how one of his hang-ups is cake from the books. They literally never mention that. I don't think there's a bit of dialogue about cake in this movie.
He does advise Mrs. Bates to not eat custard.
Yes. But there's this moment where they pan past on this one, the camera just moves past all of the people sitting at this table, and there's Mr. Woodhouse just grimacing at this cake.
It's at least five. It's at least 5 layers.
Oh, it's an absurd cake, and he just looks so upset, just staring at this cake. He's the only one in the room, and that cake is the only thing in the room, and yet he's surrounded by all this finery and all these people, and it's such a great nod to the people who really know the story.
Yes, I think Mr. Woodhouse and his screens are one of the funniest parts.
My single favorite shot in the whole film is that one point where he's just gone from bad to worse, and then you cut to him without even mentioning it. He's not the subject of the scene. I think Knightley's trying to argue with Emma over something.
Yes, here, let me elaborate on the scene.
Yes, go for it.
So, this is something that this film does very well, is intersperse humor with conflict. And so, Harriet has refused a proposal, and Mr. Knightley comes over to let Emma know that there's another match made, thinking that Emma will be very pleased that her friend is going to marry well. But Emma says, oh no, that's not going to happen. He's already been refused. And Mr. Knightley doesn't believe her, and they start having an argument when he realizes, you saw her answer, you wrote her answer.
Right.
And so they're arguing back and forth about what it is that would make a happy marriage, and Emma's saying that it's better to be beautiful than anything else, and that's all women are desired for in a wife, is just being good-natured and beautiful. And Mr. Knightley's very upset about it, and so they're having their argument, and they're walking through the house.
Yeah, and just smack dab in the middle of this conversation, it cuts to Mr. Woodhouse sitting there behind just layers of...
It's 4 screens. He's literally boxed in.
Yes. And it's the most absurd shot, and he is completely straight-faced, just reading a book, just completely, like, there is no irony there. And then, meanwhile, like, Knightley runs by Emma runs by, and Knightley chases after her, just going through that shot. The camera never moves. It's so clever. It's such a great placement. I mean, it just takes you you can barely even see him. Some of his face is cut off. Like,
yes.
So
yeah, they had to stop their argument so they could march through and not disturb Mr. Woodhouse.
Yeah, and man, yeah, those little things, and it's so subtle in some ways. Like, they don't play this up in any way. It's just there. Obviously the amount of screens is absurd. It's off the charts. But they don't mention it. The characters don't mention it. Nobody responds to it anyway. So you, as the audience, are just hit with the full force of just, this is real. This is really happening right now.
Yeah, and it's such a good way to bring in details from the book that you don't have time to devote an entire scene to. Although, if you have seen previews, you may have seen one where they were bringing Mr. Knightley a screen.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Knightley moves, and so the servants are not sure what to do with the screen. I really like how they use the servants.
Yes, that's another side thing that I think is really great in this movie. Well, what I think about the servants is that they don't play them at all ironically either. And so it works so well because, again, it makes it feel like this is a real world. These are real servants. They are dedicated as you can be to doing their job, and they take it completely seriously. And so when Mr. Woodhouse is asking for them to bring yet another screen, and not this one, but that one, they just dutifully do their duty.
They try to find a draft for him to see if
Yes.
see if there's wind getting in anywhere.
They don't laugh. They don't smirk. There's no questioning. They just do it. I mean, it's just about as British as it can get, I feel. So that's the other thing is like you die doing your duty no matter how ridiculous it is.
Well, and if the Woodhouses are the most wealthy in Highbury, that's probably the best servant position you can get, because even
Yes.
though they're ridiculous, they're also quite liberal in their charity and in how they pay their servants.
Good point. I'm sure these servants have it really good working here. They're probably treated well, and other than having to do some silly errands for Mr. Woodhouse yet again, or Emma, where they, at the very first shot of the movie, they're out there, no, not this one, that one. You know, she's
Yes.
telling them to clip a flower for her.
She definitely gets that from her father.
And they just do it because, yeah, like you said, like this is probably a really posh job for people who aren't born into, wealth like Emma and her family is. So
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the 3 eligible bachelors
yes,
in Highbury, or talked about in Highbury and eventually showing up in Highbury. We have Mr. Knightley, Mr. Elton, and Frank Churchill. So
which is interesting how they always address him almost always as Frank Churchill. It's never Mr. Churchill. It's
Mr.
just...
Churchill is his uncle.
But he died, didn't he?
No.
Oh, he didn't. Oh, okay. We only hear about the aunt, so.
I believe you'll see that Mr. Cole inquires about his uncle Churchill in a very humorous scene at the Coles for a dinner party. He's just, you can almost feel Mr. Cole putting his foot in his mouth.
I keep wanting somebody to be coming in, from that other movie we watched recently and ask where the hill is. He sees the church, but not the hill. And Frank is just sitting there going, what are we even talking about right now? I would love to see that meeting between
I think
Lady Susan.
we're talking about, yes, love and friendship, Sir James Martin, so not anything to do with Harriet Smith's Mr. Martin, who is just absolutely daft, and I think that Emma and Frank Churchill would laugh their heads off at that poor man.
Yeah.
That rich man.
Yeah, this movie, this story has a lot of very bright people in it. Even Miss Bates, I think, would run circles around this Martin. What is his name?
Sir Martin.
Sir Martin.
Sir James. Yeah.
He's wealthy, but not full of brains.
So going back to the eligible bachelors of this story, we meet Mr. Knightley first, and we've discussed that as well, that Jane Austen typically, and by typically I mean pretty much always, introduces the hero you're supposed to root for that the heroine ends up with, or before we are introduced to an alternate hero, and also possibly someone that's just horrible that you really hope doesn't propose to you.
Right.
And
yeah.
this story has it all.
Right, yeah. Emma's surely faced with, every kind of eligible bachelor, I suppose you could say. And of course, Jane Austen loves to make you start to feel the way the heroine does, and when she starts to fall for it, you do too.
There are a few exceptions, but Frank Churchill is very convincing as an eligible suitor for Emma, and this film does not include the scene, but in the story and in some adaptations, they have a scene where he comes to Emma very nervous, and it seems that he's about to propose. But what he's actually about to do is to confess his secret engagement.
It's interesting because this is sort of out of character for Frank Churchill in all that we know of him, because he is quite out there.
Yeah, he's very rarely vulnerable.
Right. He doesn't seem to take anything too seriously. Although, but yeah, like you're saying, they introduce him as this ghost of a character almost. We're just told about him. There's this history there. And so you instantly have this like sense of like, oh, that could be cool. You're almost rooting for it before you even know about it.
Right.
You know?
And Mrs. Weston makes no secret of wishing Emma could be an actual daughter for her.
Right.
If Frank Churchill, who's played by Callum Turner in this adaptation, would marry Emma, and he's relatively young, he's on the early age for getting married, and so there's no reason to think that he wouldn't be available and wouldn't be interested in being a little more wealthy. It's stated in the film that his aunt expects him to marry well, and that if he tried to make a bad match, he could be disinherited.
Right. And we've got, Miss Taylor, Mrs. Weston. She's very sweet, but she plays a pretty minor role in this film. They've definitely downplayed her a lot. She has more time in other adaptations and in the book, I believe.
Yes.
And of course, we love Mr. Weston. And so there's this, I do anyway.
Yes.
He's one of the side characters I like. He's always so positive. He's so friendly. My heart just breaks for him every time they mention Frank Churchill and how he's not coming yet again to see his father because his aunt is holding him back. And this man is such a sweet person, and he's so good-hearted, and he just wants to be a friend and a host to everybody. And yet his son just keeps never seeing him, putting him off, and it's just so sad. So you feel for them, and after a bit you start to feel like Knightley does, I think, who has, I think,
yes,
the best instincts of anyone in this movie. When Emma's instincts prove to be always wrong throughout the film, it seems that Knightley's are ever proven right for the most part.
Yeah, well, he has 16 years of experience on Emma and the benefit of having moved around a lot more. He can hear the conversations that men would have that she's not privileged to be a part of. But Mr. Knightley's just a very wise character.
Yes.
And one of the things I love that this film brings out of his character is how sweet. It's not sweetness. He's not sweet. He's very critical of Emma.
He's so noble. He cares so much about what's right.
Yes, but that's also not what I'm trying to say. He's very soft-hearted, tender, I believe is the word I'm looking for. He and his brother John, who's married to Emma's sister Isabella, are the only two that cry at the wedding at the end.
That's right.
And it is so sweet. And Isabella's looking at her husband John and just being like, "What is wrong with you?"
Well, and you get this sense that Knightley has to do what's right. He can't help it. But he's hurt almost as much as Emma is when he reprimands her later in the film. And I know this is like way out of order, but you can see that like it hurts him to be so hard on Emma. And the reason that they have a hard relationship at points is because I think Knightley is really the only one who's her equal in the film, and he's the only one who's holding a mirror up to her and showing her the truth. Emma is so controlled by her own biases and her own view of things that she doesn't see reality about herself or anyone. And so
she's a performer.
Yes.
She cares so much about appearances. I love the scene of the dinner party at the Woodhouses.
Yes.
Where Emma plays and she's just like really like Christina Aguilera-ing the music and just like
she's hamming it up, yeah.
just taking her sweet time to finish up the song she's singing, and then she goes and lets Jane Fairfax play the piano, and she's like, "I'm so sorry that you don't have your music, not because I hope I look better than you."
Well, she's trying to tell her, "Don't play. I'm so sorry you can't play." It's too bad that there's no one to follow me up.
Jane, the angel, except not quite an angel, has this insane song memorized, and Harriet and Emma both jump in the audience when the music begins.
And that's another use of the music we were talking about earlier, where it's just this she just bangs on the piano, and it's just a very clever composition where it starts on such a bang that we see them jump and we almost feel like we jump too, because it's such a sympathetic feeling of like, whoa, that started quickly. And then it's just like the most ridiculously hard piece to play that's just obviously levels above what Emma could ever do.
Yes, and you see Emma earlier pretending to practice.
Yeah.
And when Mr. Knightley comes over after the wedding, because he hadn't gone to the Weston wedding at the beginning, he comes over to ask about it. And Emma sees him from the window and goes over to the piano to practice for 2 minutes before he arrives.
Yes.
And Mr. Knightley lets her know during that scene that it doesn't really fool him. And it's not a secret that she doesn't like Jane, and it seems to be because Jane is the accomplished young woman that Emma wants to be. She wants to be seen as accomplished, but she doesn't care so much to make the efforts to be accomplished. And that's the theme of this film. This adaptation of the film changes a little bit of the ending in order to strengthen the claim that Emma becomes who she should be.
Yes.
I always get very grumpy when people are talking about Jane Austen films as if they're just romances, because that's not what the story is about. It's what the story contains.
Right.
And this story is about Emma becoming a better person through actual love and through making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, it's really good the way this movie pulls that off, I think. You know, when Emma starts to have some of her really bad moments towards the end of the film, or in the last third or so, when she really insults Miss Bates, when she really makes some big mistakes, and she ends up being wrong about so many things, she really has to experience being wrong. She has to finally admit to herself, because that's, for the first 2/3 of the film, she won't admit she's wrong with Knightley. They argue, and she's like, well, we just have different perspectives, essentially.
Yeah.
And she will not admit that she's wrong.
Even her apology is, I've come to see that we're both right, and I've not yet been proven wrong.
Right. And so at the end of the movie, she finally has to be faced with the fact that she was wrong, and she knows she was wrong. And she can't argue her way out of it. She can't do anything to disprove it, and she finally admits it and says she's sorry. And there's this great scene, and this is another way where I just love the use of side characters and stuff. And one of my favorite things about this movie is the relationship between Emma and her father, Mr. Woodhouse. There's this moment where she's just like, I've been terrible. I've been terribly, I've just been inconsiderate. And she's sitting in the window frame in this hallway, and her father just comes and sits with her. Yeah. And you can see the look on his face. He looks more distraught than any other moment, any other like upset that he has from his sicknesses and his hypochondria. And he just is so sorry for his daughter, who he loves more than anyone else in the world. She is definitely the most dear person to him. And it's just so sweet.
Yeah.
But I also love how you're seeing, at the same time, Knightley is upset around this time. And I think, the other great scene, one of the most standout scenes of this movie, is when they both realize they want to be together after the dance.
We have touched on this previously, but the dance scene and the missing gloves.
Conspicuously missing gloves on only Knightley and Emma.
Right, because a lot of Jane Austen adaptations just don't have a gloves budget. And so they must be ignored or forgiven, depending on your mood. But this one...
Well, Emma dances with Frank first.
Emma dances with Frank, and they have gloves on. You can see that, especially it's symbolic for Frank in that he is hiding something. He is hiding his engagement, and he's playing everyone, and he's using Emma, who in a previous scene has almost figured out that he was smiling at Jane Fairfax, but he misleads her.
Yes.
He's never going to be as close as he could because he's a gloved hand.
But yeah, when he's hiding something, right? Like, she doesn't realize that they can't be close because of the very important reason that he's engaged. But besides that, there's the fact that he's hiding something. He's not being fully open.
And he's just not a good influence on her behavior, although that's not so much in this scene as later. And that's not what gloves symbolize. Just because they make a point to not have gloves for the dance with Mr. Knightley and Emma. And they do have gloves for Mr. Knightley when he dances with Harriet as well, which matters equally.
Right.
That they're not, it's not the same level of intimacy.
Right.
It's not the same relationship. So when Emma asks Mr. Knightley to dance with her, it's very likely this is the first time they've danced together. She seemed surprised that he did dance. And we know that they didn't have balls very frequently, and Emma rarely went to the Coles because she has a classist problem with them. That's only hinted at in the film, but is there. So it's very possible that Mr. Knightley doesn't, by rule, dance, and that when he was young enough to dance, if he ever did, Emma was too young to have been at those parties. And so whether it's their first dance or their first dance with some awareness, at least on Mr. Knightley's side, of his envy for Frank Churchill, that you can see there's this beautiful tension between them and their dance, and they get so caught up in it that they miss a step, and he's about to speak to her, and her carriage leaves.
They linger on holding on to each other too long. They're supposed to part and go dance with another person at that moment, right?
Right, because it's the three
people. And then they hold on to each other too long. And both of them are clearly feeling it. I think the whole movie seems to slow down at that moment. The tone and the speed change. It's very different from when she dances with Frank Churchill, where it's like everyone in the room that it's focused on the camera. Whereas with her and Knightley, it's almost like I almost expected them to do one of those shots where everyone else in the room disappears and it's just them dancing alone in a dark room, kind of thing, where like they do in some other, romantic comedies and things.
Yeah, in the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, for example.
Yes, so it feels very much like that. They make you feel that way, even though they don't actually do it, because they're being a little bit more real. But something has clearly changed. And when he looks at her in the carriage and she moves forward to look at him and then is taken by surprise and falls back against the back of the seat.
You could feel that in the theater. The audience was like...
You're like holding your breath, yeah. And there's this sudden... And he's just like pining. They both are. He runs after her. He does not have good shoes on for running, and it shows in the way his gait works.
The running is excellent. Good job.
But yeah, it's so surprising that he runs after her, because probably he didn't bring a carriage as usual.
Yes, well, he actually left his carriage for the Bates.
Oh, that's right.
But anyway.
But then Emma is also... That's such a great scene where he's running to her and she's in that hallway, that same hallway that she's later mourning in with her father.
Yeah, curled up with a statue.
And she's like super upset. She's like, I'm feeling... She almost doesn't even know what she feels at that moment, it feels like. Because she doesn't seem quite in tune with the fact that she's in love with Knightley as Knightley is about her. But then he runs into the courtyard. She sees him and she's going to meet him, and that's when Frank comes in, swinging Harriet around, almost hitting people, which is funny. Just so good. That's that thing you said about like introducing comedy in the middle of conflict.
Yes.
There's all this tension and so many relationship aspects going on right there.
Yes, that can only be accomplished by compressing the story. Not that I think that you have to compress the story, but again, for a film.
Well, and what a great, not contrived way to put off the final romantic meeting, because every romance does this, and I know it's not just a romance, but every romantic book or movie does this, where it's like, oh, we want these two to be together. Oh no, something's interrupted it right when they're about to kiss, or right when they're about to confess their love. And so here it's Frank running in with Harriet, who looks like she's a rag doll, and he's almost hitting Knightley with her. And then I just love when Harriet's lying down on the couch and Emma's like, no, don't go, to them. And so they both run back into the room, Knightley and Frank Churchill, just like, oh no, we've got to be there for them. And it's just so funny.
Yes, and then Emma, bless her heart, Emma is so focused on making matches for other people that she kind of screws up. She gives mixed signals to Mr. Knightley because she's trying to get Frank Churchill to stay for Harriet's sake. But Mr. Knightley gets so mad, he's like, we'll both go.
Yes.
Well, here's what I wanted to know from you guys. Do you think Frank Churchill flung Harriet on purpose?
Yeah, well, there's all that awkward tension between Frank and and Knightley too, which I just love. At at the dance, they both look at each other and then they just go, oh, okay, and I'm gonna look the other way. And
I kept thinking that they were imagining, or they were embarrassed to show up wearing the same outfit.
Well, also in that same dance scene before the romantic dance between Knightley and Emma, it seems that they both think that Jane is looking at them and smiling. And so they're both smiling, and then they look at each other and they're still smiling. And then they're just like, ooh, this is awkward. And also, was she smiling at me or him? And so it's just really, really well orchestrated. Again, like the choreography of this film is really brilliant.
So let's spend a couple minutes on the Eltons.
Yes.
So
yes, great characters.
Mr. Elton, that's Josh O'Connor, makes the most hilarious faces. I said one of the things I really would like to do when this comes out on Blu-ray and DVD is edit together all of the weird faces he makes without any dialogue and just see how long I can make this video of just Mr. Elton and his eyebrows.
Well, you could easily put him to some like horror music too, and his wolfish grin would be so creepy. I mean, it's already kind of creepy as it is, but like he's a fairly handsome guy, but like the way he uses his expressions makes you very put off, I feel.
Yes. Yeah, he's a very different Mr. Elton than we've seen in other adaptations, but it works very well. He is just a little too ridiculous. They give him the same line to say when he's trying to make small talk at the Westons. Anytime he talks about Frank Churchill's property that he will inherit.
Yes. He very clearly is using his position as pastor to kind of showboat a little bit. He's such a performer. He's even more off the deep end ridiculous than Emma is. Emma cares about appearances, whereas Elton is just kind of laughably over the top,
Which is why it feels almost as if he has summoned his wife from his imagination. Because after he's rejected by Emma and has no intention of Harriet, he returns with
Augusta.
Augusta.
She is so funny, and I already think that these Regency style dresses make women's necks look extremely long, but
Tanya Reynolds.
No one has a longer neck in this movie than Augusta Elton.
Yes, and yes, that is her hair. I know that's what you're asking.
Oh yeah, those weird bows in her hair. I had no idea. I was like, what is going on with her hair? I thought it was a weird bow that matched her hair.
No, that's her hair. It's apparently It's apparently an 1830s look from some fashion plates that my friends have found.
Well, she is just absurd. And it seems perfect, like you said, for Mr. Elton because he's absurd. And
Yes.
So when we first meet her, she's like, I can't remember the line she says about like, I'd never want to look gaudy. I don't want to wear too much
She
adornment.
quite despises puppies. She also talks about later.
But the great contrast scene that they have when they first introduce Mrs. Elton is the scene where they go into the chapel almost exactly the same way as the first scene in the movie, one of the first scenes in the movie. But then suddenly, oh no, the Woodhouse's pew is taken. Like, what's going on and who is this person? And it kind of takes a few seconds for it to even dawn on you, even if you know the story. And they're so confused and put off by it. And of course, it's Frank Churchill's father, Mr. Weston, who helps them out by moving. And so, because he's such a sweet person.
Mr. Weston is the embodiment of you can always pull up one more chair to the table. The Eltons are exactly what they should be, and by that I mean absolutely nothing that a pastor and his wife should be.
Yes.
But they do such a good job in this film of portraying that.
Yes.
This film does spend a lot less time on Mrs. Elton's plaguing of Jane Fairfax. I really appreciate when films don't spend a terribly long time on Jane Fairfax and how miserable she is all the time, because you can kind of get it across in just a little bit, and they don't need to really drag out how inappropriate Frank Churchill is treating her by flirting and trying to throw Highbury off from their secret engagement.
Right, yeah, and she has no ability to do anything about any of this. She's completely at the mercy of hoping that he still goes through with it, but she's...
Right, because she can't even confide in her own family because Miss Bates can't keep a secret.
Yes.
I think that if Frank had trusted his father and Mrs. Weston, that they would have kept his secret for him because they wouldn't want him to be disinherited.
Right.
And that's, the Churchills are Mr. Weston's first wife's family.
Oh, okay. That explains the name
So,
difference.
and that's some of the stress behind it.
I couldn't remember.
Mr. Weston gave up his rights to his own son because he couldn't afford to keep him.
Right.
He's only recently purchased the property that he and the late Miss Taylor live in, Randall's. He didn't own that previously, it belonged to someone else, and he's finally saved up enough money to be able to purchase a place, and that's when he remarries, and that's when the story begins.
Well, and I know in this movie, when they find out about Frank and Jane's secret engagement, they're mostly upset for Emma's sake. And also just that they were not told, I think, is the main thing. They're not so concerned about who he marries, particularly, except that they care about, their friends. And so they would have helped Emma,
And by all appearances, after Box Hill, it seemed that Frank Churchill and Emma were at least horrible flirts, if not intending more by it.
Yeah, that's one of the things about their relationship with Frank and Emma, too, is that it's always very shallow and flirty, which is such a contrast to Emma's relationship with Knightley. Obviously, it's easy to just hang out and be silly with Frank, but she clearly knows that there's a difference even before she realizes it.
One of the things I like about Jane Austen's stories is her discussion on how a good marriage is more than just equality of, and pick something, money, class, whatever. It's not about that. It's about finding a partner that makes you better. To look at Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins chose very well of a wife and better than he deserved because he's a silly man, but it helped Charlotte, and so you can at least understand their relationship. And there are several good relationships to look at that are adults in the heroines' lives. And I think the Westons are that for Emma. But for Emma, if she married Frank Churchill, they would not have had a moral compass that either of them needed.
Yeah, there's a good point there where Knightley clearly is what Emma needs. Like I said before, he really shows her what she needs to know, and he's honest with her because he really cares about who she is deep down in the center, and he cares about her being a good person too. And I think the thing about Emma is that she has so many things going for her. She's very talented, she's very bright, and
she's very rich.
and there's a lot of potential for her to do a lot of great good, but it's misguided in the first part of the movie, and she's trying to use it for strange things that she thinks she can have influence on. And if she probably really thought about it, it's like, that's not really a lasting legacy. And you don't want to force Harriet, for example, to marry somebody who, she was trying to get her to marry Elton, who turns out to be not a very good person anyway, which Emma probably should have seen, but she didn't. And I think Knightley called that one too. But I think, that's another thing too that I really like in this movie, is that she is really wrong in how she treats Harriet, even though she thinks she's trying to do the best for her. And you see in the introduction of Harriet how much she really cares for Mr. Martin, for Robert Martin. And I thought it was so sweet. And I think that's a little bit different in this adaptation compared to other ones, where it really shows how delighted she is just to see Robert Martin.
It's because he's the most attractive man in Highbury.
Yeah, he does seem to be more attractive than the other bachelors.
He's certainly better looking than Frank Churchill, at least to my taste.
But I really appreciate how that comes full circle, and that's something I think they do in the ending very well too.
Yeah, so let's talk about the ending, and then we need to wrap up.
Sure, yeah.
Well, let's continue talking about Mr. Martin for a moment, since that's an important ending. I just loved the scene where he runs after Harriet out of the haberdashery.
Yes, and he tells her where to go because it's flooded.
Yes, and it's
raining.
It's another catch your breath moment of just how much he's trying to be sweet and how heartbroken he still is and how uncomfortable Harriet is, and you can just really see how young she is and how it's not unreasonable to, with a little more prodding, make her fall back in love with whoever you want her to fall in love with. But certainly that man is a good man and worth falling in love with.
And I don't know that she ever stopped being in love with him. She was just so influenced by Emma, because she cared so much about, like, she just kind of thinks that Emma knows everything and that she has to listen to her because she cares so much about Emma, and she just assumes that Emma's right. So Emma has way too much power, and she needs to use that wisely.
Harriet had so much to lose. Yeah. Emma made it very clear to Harriet, if Harriet didn't do what Emma wanted her to do, that she might not be friends with Emma anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Emma realized how influential she was, but she did know. She knew she was influencing, and that's very obvious in the scene where she has Harriet refuse Mr. Martin. But I love how they resolve
I appreciate
Harriet's
that
arc.
Emma really has to actually go. She actually takes responsibility finally and goes to Robert Martin.
Yeah, and I think that's a good change. Emma spends a lot more time focused on Harriet in her proposal, in Emma's own proposal scene. Because she has a fight with Harriet about Mr. Knightley and who Mr. Knightley is in love with.
Yeah.
And Harriet says that she refused Robert Martin because of Emma.
Right.
Emma carries that into her walk in the garden where Mr. Knightley comes back from London. He hurries back after visiting his brother and Emma's sister to try to get away from Emma because he thought that he couldn't stand to see her be in love with someone that wasn't him. And the book says it in such a loving way of that he'd gone to the wrong place to get over his feelings because his siblings or their siblings were such a picture of domestic happiness that didn't help him feel better. But he hurries back from London after he finds out that Frank Churchill was engaged, and he's trying to console Emma because he thought that they were in love, or at least that she was in love with him. And Emma just can't stop thinking about Harriet, which is a little odd to me. And so my first watch of it, I was like, shut up about Harriet.
Yeah, it's really interesting because he confesses his love to her there, and her first thoughts are about Harriet, and I understand why they do it. It's because they're trying to have that closure and help Emma really grow as a person and think about somebody other than herself, more than her own designs.
But because of that, because the way it plays in the book, she thinks about Harriet a little bit later. But Emma in the book tries very hard not to admit to Mr. Knightley that Harriet had feelings for him because she didn't want to betray her friend, and so it just changes that dynamic. But I think it works, especially upon future viewings of Emma. I was able to understand why the choices were made, because in the book also Harriet's sent to London to get away and also to have her teeth go see a dentist.
Oh.
And it's just those are kind of convoluted details that aren't necessary, but that's how she's able to meet the Martins by chance, which was not chance at all because Mr. Knightley told him to try again. And so this way it's a lot more streamlined of Emma realizing Harriet was going to be hurt again.
Yeah, and it's her fault, and she's done it multiple times to her now, so she's just like, she's really got to make up for it. I'm just disappointed by it because it really does kind of step on the romance and make it a lot less potent. We see Knightley rejoice because he's like, yes, I told her, and she seemed to be okay with it. Like, yeah. But like, I'm getting more from him and his acting that he seems to have gotten a positive response than I am from her, where I'm almost like, wait, did she give a positive response?
Because all she says is, I will go talk to Mr. Martin. And so she takes her portrait that she'd painted of Harriet and a goose, which if she'd listened to Harriet talking at the very beginning when they meet, she would know that the Martins have the best geese in all of England, so there's no reason to bring her an apology goose.
That's pretty funny. I didn't realize that.
It's probably a ridiculous side note, but I just thought it was very funny that she brought a goose. I'm like, great, do you see how many geese they have? They don't need your goose.
Right.
They do need your apology, though, so I think that's
yeah,
fine.
Well, I think the meaning was felt, and I really appreciate that closure for Robert Martin, too, because he also did nothing wrong. He went all by his instinct and his heart, and also he went to Knightley and followed his advice. And so he'd done everything right. He was very adequate for this girl in terms of all of the standards of society, and he could provide for her and everything else. And she loved him. She clearly loved him.
Yes, and I love that's the scene we get. So Harriet comes to talk to Emma, and Harriet has her moment to stand up for herself.
Yeah.
And she says, I'm going to marry Robert Martin, and also my father's going to meet me, and he sells galoshes. And I love the way Mia Goth says galoshes.
Yeah.
It's so sweet and cute. She's just adorable as Harriet.
Right. And I think that's such a great ending for Harriet, too, because Harriet finally gets to, like, speak for herself. And she gets that closure. And again, Emma actually has to face the consequences of her actions, and it's only fair. It's not that I want Emma to suffer and stuff, but it's like, Emma, you can't just play with people's hearts.
Yes.
And not make up for it. You have to actually help those people you care for.
And this way, we believe that Emma will be able to continue to be friends with Harriet because of how warm she is to her. She does what is right for both of them instead of what is best for Emma herself.
It also proves to us as an audience that Emma really is a good person. She's not just selfish, because she does care about doing what's right. It's just that she sees things so much from her own view, and she can have such a selfish perspective that she really had to make some big mistakes before she finally realized it. And now I guess we'll get to the real final ending with Mr. Knightley and Emma.
Yes, so we have another scene with screens and Emma between Mr. Knightley and her father, and Mr. Knightley comes over to Emma's regular seat on the couch and sits next to her, and her father dictates a screen being carried over. And so they use that advantage of a screen to share their first kiss.
Well, and I think Mr. Woodhouse actually knows, and he's trying to hint to Mr. Knightley because he's like, Mr. Knightley, do you notice a draft about the knees? Or he doesn't say about the knees yet, and Mr. Knightley's like, no, and he's just kind of frowning. He's like,
really?
What are you talking about?
You think it's a hint?
Well, and Mr. Woodhouse is like, oh, a shame. And then Mr. Knightley is like, he kind of stops, he pauses, he looks back over to Mr. Woodhouse, and he's like, maybe I do feel a bit of a draft. And Mr. Woodhouse is like, yes, about the knees. And so then they bring over and he's like, no, not that one, this one, and they bring over a screen, and it's this ridiculous screen that completely blocks Emma and Knightley off from him. It could be that he has no idea what he's doing. I mean, there's a side of me that wishes that was true.
I like your interpretation. I thought that Mr. Knightley was just being an opportunist. But Emma does kiss first, so...
And so I think that's the closure that they're trying to give us, of that she is actually choosing Knightley now. She's actually responding.
Well, she's no longer between them because Mr. Knightley comes to join her at the couch, and that's symbolic for the conversation they didn't have of he will come and join her at Hartfield and give up Donwell Abbey for the time being.
Well, and this is more of that really important relationship between Emma and her father, because the main concern for Emma in this movie has been for her father. She's like, I can't leave him. And they put little plants here and there of him being like, you can never leave me. And he's still so upset about Isabella leaving. And she's like, Father, she got married 7 years ago, he still isn't used to it or whatever. And he hates when Miss Taylor leaves and marries Mr. Weston. Emma, she's like, I can't leave this poor man who I love all alone in this house. And so she can only marry Knightley on the condition of him coming to join her. And then Mr. Woodhouse is still just so heartbroken when they're getting married. And you said something about the book, right? Where he comes to terms with it because he's like, oh, I suppose that Mr. Knightley would be helpful to have around.
Yes, so in the book, Jane Austen writes that there were foxes or something getting into the hen houses of the neighborhood. And so that it would be nice to have a young man to check on that, is basically the father's excuse. But I think anything that Emma really wanted, Mr. Woodhouse would never ultimately deny her. And so since it was something so convenient as her getting married but not leaving.
Well, and there's this side of it too where it's like Mr. Knightley comes over and talks with them every day.
Yeah, it's kind of...
Mr. Knightley is probably Mr. Woodhouse's closest friend, if we're serious, if we're honest, you know. And there's this moment when they're walking down the aisle and Emma is walking away from her father and he just looks so completely ruined and heartbroken. But then he looks to Mr. Knightley after she's left. He looks at Mr. Knightley and they have this moment of like, he's like, I'm happy for you. I'm proud you're going to be my son, essentially. And there's just something in the way he looks at him where he's just like, he's okay with it, even though he is like still in a sense losing his daughter, even though he's not losing his daughter. I mean, she chose to stay there. So it's just really, really good subtle acting. All the facial acting is just so clever.
Yeah, it's a beautiful scene. I mean, every scene in the chapel is just gorgeous.
I want to honorable mention that scene at John Knightley's house too, where Mr. Elton brings up the weather because he was feeling awkward about what to talk about. And so they're all sitting at this table and Mr. Elton says, seasonable weather we're having. And then everyone looks at Mr. Woodhouse and he's like, what? Do you think it might snow? And there's like this beat there where literally everyone in the room all looks at Mr. Woodhouse and then he looks disturbed and they're like, oh no. And then suddenly it's chaos. And that's another of those like...
At the Westons at Christmas.
Oh yes. It's another... Oh, it's the Westons' house. It's another choreographed scene. And of course, Isabella, I guess, has some of the same fears about weather and sickness as her father.
In the book, she's going to walk home in the snow.
But yeah, anyway, just so many clever scenes, clever moments, clever acting. It's just very, very good. And we never even talked about how pretty the sets and the backgrounds. I mean, it's probably all location actually. But everything in this movie is so well designed. The costuming is brilliant. Oh, and of course, in that very last scene where they finally kiss, Knightley and Emma, you have the servants just look awkwardly on as they're kissing, and then they both look at each other and turn to face towards the camera away from the kissing, and it's really funny.
They're like, pivot.
Yeah, but there's no irony in their faces. So
right, so that's all we'll say for Emma today. We'll probably talk more Jane Austen very soon, so remember to like and subscribe.
Yes, and please leave some comments. We want to hear what you thought of this too, and the favorite moments and things, favorite characters. We're also on Twitter with the handle @Scribe&Scribble, 2 B's. And yeah, let's have a conversation about it. But until next time.
Bye.